Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the panel. My name is Hannah Rosen. I'm the host of Radio Atlantic, which is the Atlantic's main podcast these days, and I've been a writer for them and an audio person at NPR at a show called Invisibilia before that. And today we are here to talk about isolation, but in a happy way. So these are our fellow panelists with a lot of expertise. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, say a little bit about what they study, and then we'll get going. So we'll start with Mark.
So I'm a recovering political hack who managed to make it to Brown. About 12 years ago, I wrote a book called The Vanishing Neighbor, which tries to understand how changes in the way we each invest our own social capital, who we choose to invest our time and attention with, has changed, and how that's affected all sorts of things like why we can't get things done politically.
Virginia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Virginia Thomas. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Middlebury College in Vermont. And I study solitude, positive solitude, so the other side of the coin from loneliness and social isolation. And in particular, I'm very interested in what I call solitude skills. How do people be alone and enjoy it and benefit from it?
I'm Michael Maltzin. I'm an architect based in Los Angeles. Our work is really in many different places across the globe, but with a particular focus on Los Angeles, which is a extremely complex, of course, quite dynamic and always changing city. I'm particularly interested in architecture's ability to navigate public and private realms. These two parts and components of our lives. And I think I'm specifically focused on how architecture can try to help foster connections between people, between communities, within cities.
So you've all, I'm sure, heard the terms loneliness. America's more lonely. Like and it's not just in the US, it's all over the world. And so what I want to do in this panel is get a little more granular. Like, what are we talking about? Are we actually talking about loneliness? What's the difference between loneliness and isolation? Because we're actually not talking about loneliness. We're talking about the thing that's changed hugely in American culture is basically we don't hang out anymore. So from 2003 to 2023, we'll start with this statistic. How much time Americans spend with other people versus themselves dipped by 20%. And that's a very short period for it to dip that much. And that's all we know. So what we're going to do here is fill in that picture. What does that mean? Is that terrible? Are there good things in there? What exactly does it mean? Are our houses built in such a way to encourage us to do that? Why are we doing that, and what does it mean? Mark, who are we hanging out with and not hanging out with? This is what your work concerns. It's not like we're not hanging out with nobody.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Right. So if you organized your social universe on a grid that looks like the rings of Saturn, with your most intimate connections, your best friend, your parents, your children, your spouse in the innermost rings, and then moving further and further out, less intimacy, so that the TSA agent you spoke to is in the outermost ring last time you went through the airport. What's happened, I think, over the course of the last half century is that we have taken more capital and invested it in the innermost rings. So, like, I'm in touch with my wife lots of times a day, even though she's at the office and I'm at home. Secondly, we have invested much more time in the outermost ring. So I live in Rhode Island, but I'm a big Cincinnati Bengals fan. It's, in fact, the only interesting thing about me. Also interesting is there are only 17 of us in the entire world. And so we all know each other, even though we're separated. And because we're investing more of our time and attention in those inner and outermost rings, we have chosen, in most cases, to abandon what I call the middle rings, which are the sorts of relationships that are familiar but not intimate. People who you know because you might bowl in a league together, to borrow Robert Putnam's analogy, or people you would know from the PTA meeting or from the local bar or from the coffee shop, who you would, if you bumped into them, you would know to ask them about something in their life beyond, like, the weather. And those relationships have dissipated. And I think that's for good and for bad. And we'll talk about that more.
Yeah, we'll get into that because some of those changes are great. I mean, it's all over the map. Those changes have had huge, it sounds simple when you put it in terms of a visual like that, but they've had huge societal implications, which we'll get into in the panel. Virginia, you have a slightly different view around isolation, an unusual view that you don't hear that often. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, thank you. So there's no doubt that Americans are spending more and more time alone. But there is a difference between loneliness and solitude. So some of those folks spending lots of time alone are indeed lonely. They are indeed isolated and they don't want to be. But I'm really interested in the people who are spending more time alone and who want that time alone. They're longing for that time to spend time by themselves, to self-connect, to take a break from our very busy, productive, extroverted culture, and be alone with themselves. So one of the things I like to think about, because lots of people ask me, well, what's the difference between loneliness and solitude? And the way I think of it is that loneliness is a feeling. And we've all felt it. It's this feeling of we're not connected and we want to be. Or
like you'd be around a million people and still feel lonely. It has nothing to do with
being alone.
Hanging out or being alone, right?
Exactly. You can feel lonely in lots of different situations. But solitude is really a space. I think of it as a space we enter. And it doesn't even have to be a physical space, although it's nice if it is, that we have some, physical aloneness. But I think of it as this psychological space that we can enter. And then that space is like a container that holds the potential for lots of different things to happen. And I think we'll talk about some of them on this panel, really productive, restorative things that are beneficial. It also has the potential for loneliness. And so that's why when I talk about solitude skills, I think that's key for helping us figure out if we are alone, do we have the skills to be good company for ourselves and use that time well?
Okay, speaking of spaces, Michael, architecture, our ways of living seep into architecture, and then architecture also drives the ways that we live. So can you show us your slides and sort of go through?
I'm going to show some slides because that's what architects have to do. You have to bring some images, otherwise we don't know how to explain what we're talking about.
It's nice to look at things.
What I wanted to do, as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of my thinking, a lot of our focus in the work that we do in our office is around that relationship between public and private. And that can happen at many, many different scales. And what I wanted to do was just quickly take you through three projects at different scales, starting with a house. Because the house is in many ways, I think, one of the greatest examples of this changing dynamic between public and private, between a more internal life and our external life. And we did a house a number of years ago in the hills just above Los Angeles, actually just above the kind of quintessential post-war suburban sprawl. And that house is right next to the Cyrulnik House, which was a house designed in the 1950s by Richard Neutra, a famous modernist. And that house, I'd say, is the kind of, again, quintessential modernist house, completely transparent. The idea at that time and in that house was that we should be as connected to everything around us as possible. Those architects were trying to dissolve the boundaries, the walls that enclose us between our internal life and our external life.
And each other as well? Like, was the idea you would see, like, open spaces, you would just see?
Absolutely. Maybe more ideally, you were in a bucolic landscape, but of course, that also meant that you were in close proximity to the neighborhoods, the communities around you. The clients who lived there had developed lives that were very public lives out in the world, and they started to become very concerned with that and, in a sense, wanted the alter ego in another house. We designed a house that was maybe more monastic on the exterior, more closed on the exterior. It was 7 sides, a little bit of an unusual form, but that had incredible transparency on the inside, almost as if we had taken the idea idea of the Neutra house, transparency around the perimeter, and folded it in on itself. And for me, Virginia talking about space is so interesting. I think that one of the real challenges in architecture is how does it relate to the space that we all live in now, a space that I've often described as that of simultaneity. We're connected to, it seems like, all people, all things, all of the time. Is there an architectural equivalent to that? Maybe better, maybe worse, but we were really trying to explore that here where the internal life of the house was so important, those relationships. So bedrooms, kitchen, bathrooms were, in a sense, all open to each other. Maybe a bit radical, but an interesting experiment.
Can I ask you about that for a second? Is because if I, knowing nothing about architecture, that's a real metaphor, those two houses that you just showed. It's like what's happening now is people are spending a huge amount more time at home doing whatever they're doing. And it seems to me that that second house reflects that very strongly. Like, that's a house that's designed for the for the people who live inside the house, and it's designed to close yourself off from sort of input from outside the house. Is there a mood associated in architecture? Like, are you thinking like, this house embodies this house embodies this, or it's not that stark because you know the clients?
Well, no, I think that's absolutely true. Mark and I were talking about this a little bit before, that there is increasingly a move, I wouldn't necessarily just say in architecture, but in development as a whole, in real estate even, in the houses throughout, certainly the US, to accommodate this increasingly inward-facing life that many people are living, detached from the city around you, from the neighborhoods, from a lot of the institutions. You can live an incredibly vibrant life, at least it seems that way, inside your house. You have access to almost everything. I once remember someone saying that the generation that's growing up now is the first generation for whom being sent to their room is no longer a punishment.
Yeah.
And so, I think that is becoming more and more the realities of our lives, and architecture has always, throughout history, represented the culture that we live in. It's always trying to be an illustration of how we think about living.
Let's pause. We'll actually come right back to this. I want to ask you guys about that. When you saw those two houses, is that a reflection of what you were saying? Like, is that the physical manifestation of we're much more connected to the inner ring that we're close to, and we're kind of blinding ourselves from things outside that?
Absolutely, is the short answer. I mean, if you're in that house that is cut off from the rest of the world, of the landscape right around you, it does not mean that you are cut off from the people that you love most, and it's really doesn't mean that I'm cut off from my 16 other Cincinnati Bengals fans. Like, we're going to find each other
in there,
online.
in that house.
Yeah.
I can't decide if like I feel like in your two areas of research, like, there are things you would find alarming about that, and there are things you would find comforting about that. It's just a different reaction to that shift.
Yeah, I find the idea of open concept and transparent everything kind of terrifying, because there's no private space to go to.
Right.
I once read in some architectural article many years ago, some architect advocating the need to create in a home these little away spaces. And as a person who has an open concept home and does not like it, I thought, yes, we need little, spots in the home where people can tuck away from the hubbub of, even if it's your inner circle, there can be a lot going on. And so to create spaces for the private self, for some internal, time, I think is productive, because it's a balance, right?
Okay, parentheses over. Continue.
Well, zooming out a little bit more, what happens when it's not so much an individual family, group of people, a couple living in a house? What happens when it's really more a multifamily building where there are a number of individuals? We've been doing work over the years with a nonprofit, the Skid Row Housing Trust, focused on providing permanent housing for formerly homeless individuals. This is a group that in a city like Los Angeles, over the years, the culture has, in a sense, tried to isolate those individuals to certain areas of the city, largely so that we wouldn't have to see them. It's a community that has been largely anonymous in the city, although that, of course, is growing. This project, Carver Apartments, tried to change that dynamic in a couple of ways. One was creating a community of those individuals right next to the 10 freeway, which is as much our main street in Los Angeles as you can get. The building is shaped in an unusual way on purpose. There are some pragmatic reasons for that, but it's also to create a form that people might drive by and say, what is that? Who lives there? And just by starting to create that connect or that question, one of our ambitions was to start a kind of conversation in your head of connection with who might live there. Another part of that, and it's very small, and by no means does it change fully the dynamic of this separation and isolation, but we did combine the laundry room and the TV room. The laundry room is the most important space in these buildings because it's a place where the community comes together. But we placed it on the same level, third floor, as the highway, so that as you're zooming, this is false. Cars don't move this quickly most times in Los Angeles. Most times you're dead stopped in traffic. But there's this chance to just see each other. And again, I don't think that changes the situation, but maybe it's a place where architecture can at least put a wrench in the works, change a little bit the expectation of that separation.
That's really, really interesting. So I'm going to pause you again, because now I feel like we need to understand. So we understand what you're trying to do, which is put two things in conversation with each other at the very least. Because why? Because if they're not in conversation, we haven't yet talked about the harms of the shift that you have described.
Yeah.
What's the problem?
Yeah. The inner rings, the people that you love most, you know well, you know what they think. You're not generally being exposed to new ideas or to difference in the inner rings. The outer rings, like as soon as I find out you're a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, you're dead to me. I'm not going to talk to you. Right? So the middle rings, these places that are familiar but not intimate, are really the avenue by which an individual sees outside their own bubble. So it's the moment where you and someone who voted for the other candidate in the presidential election both reach for the same donut at the back of the PTA meeting, where you have a conversation, you realize that person's actually pretty normal, sort of interesting.
Or at least a person.
Or at least a person. Right. I'll start small for you, Hannah.
No. Listen, I did a whole project about my January 6th neighbors, so I'm down with this. I'm just saying, it's
fair
like,
enough.
it's a person.
Right. It's a person. And that's the beginning of being able to see sort of horizontally what another person's experience is going to be like.
Yeah, like you can't just walk. This is like a tiny architectural thing telling you you're not just walking by the homeless person. Like you at least there's some curiosity that gets sparked in your head. Yeah.
Yes.
Because what has happened over the years? I mean, we probably all sense this, although we don't think about it in terms of sociological trends. Like, I guess what you're saying is a lot of the breakdown, this is like the buzzwords, like polarization, inability to talk to each other.
I'm big into buzzwords, yeah.
Sorry, I hate
buzzwords. No, I love them.
But we're in Aspen, so we're allowed a little bit more buzzwords, just a few. Right, so it's actually a problem, is what it's become a problem.
I think that it is the sense that we are isolated and that we can't really understand what other people are thinking who live right near us is born from the fact that we are not investing our own social capital in these types of relationships anymore.
Like they used to be somewhat like you knew you had a responsibility as a neighbor, citizen, person to just say something to the person.
Yes, in fact, the term neighborly has changed in meaning, that it once meant that you were going to bring cookies to the person that moved in next door, and now it means if you hear something through the wall, you don't acknowledge it when you see each other in the lobby. And so like that's a big shift in American culture.
Mm-hmm. Virginia, do you want to address like the big sociological trends versus the internal emotional trends? Because I think
Yeah.
when you talk about it at the level of sociology, it just feels alarming and
Right.
overwhelming.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. So at the personal level, the individual level, this idea of positive solitude, and what I find, let me just start by saying I see a connection between what you're saying and what I study, in that I think what brings it together is that I think a lot of people are experiencing a crisis of connection. So connections in the way that you're talking about. But then in my field, I'm seeing a crisis of connection to the self. And I'm not talking about like a narcissistic move of, like being self-absorbed. There's great research actually that says narcissists avoid alone time at all costs because they don't have attention on them at the time. But I'm really interested in this connection with the self that happens in solitude, where we get back in touch with our authentic self. What do we believe? Who are we as a person? What do we want? What do we really feel and think, aside from all of the input we're getting from the pressure from family, from parents if you're a young person, the pressure from society, the pressure to be very public facing and on in social media. It's like we want a break from that. But if we're immersed in that, it can be very hard to figure out, well, what path do I take? What direction do I take? And so solitude is this space where we can have time to reconnect with the self. And one last thing before you, what's very interesting about this is that it's reciprocal with relationships. So what we find over and over again is that when people who need to be alone, who want to reconnect with themselves, when they get the chance to do that, they are able to get out of the space of solitude, re-enter the world of relationships a better person. They're more emotionally available, they're more grounded, they're more centered. And so these relationships benefit because we allowed time and space for this self-connection that's so crucial.
The interesting thing about what you're saying, which I hadn't thought of, is that we do tend to, the way this conversation is framed, the way most of us think of this, they're opposites. There's like solitude and time that you spend with yourself, and there's time you spend with other people. I feel like you're drawing the line slightly differently, which is like there's a tremendous amount of noise in the world, and then there's just, I don't know, I'm searching for a Buddhist concept here, but something like groundedness, which fosters both some kind of connection, which works both for yourself and other people.
Right.
I'm stumbling towards redrawing the lines, but it's something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Once somebody asked me to talk about the difference between solitude and relationships, and I said, those are the wrong terms. It's all about relationships. It's relationship with yourself and then relationships with others. But to me, they're not opposites.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to let you continue because I like this way of doing it where we come back to slides and go around. It's fun,
the last project I wanted to show was a project which finished actually just at the end of the pandemic in Los Angeles, which is the new 6th Street Viaduct, a bridge about a mile long, connecting two very different sides of the city across the LA River. The Arts District, which you see more or less on the left in this image, and Boyle Heights, which is historic, really over the last 50 years been the center of Latino culture in the city. And the old 6th Street Viaduct was really beloved because it was this point, especially for the residents in Boyle Heights, as a symbol and as a device to access the city, for their world, their community to grow and connect out to the city as a whole. The bridge, though, not only connects the two sides of the city, but there's a whole neighborhood of businesses and residences underneath it as well. It's in a intense part of the city. It has a very strong symbolic and iconic appearance and form in the city, but it's really that idea that it crosses and maybe has the potential to weave together the city that makes the bridge different than a lot of the ways that infrastructure works in Los Angeles. Since the war, LA is known as a city of highways. They were originally thought about as ways to connect us, tethers to help communities and workplaces all relate to each other. But over time, for lots of reasons, including It's always, there's gridlock all the time. They've done more to isolate and siloize different neighborhoods and areas than they have to connect them. This bridge is really trying to change that dynamic, to use infrastructure as a kind of connection machine. And through ramps and stairs and different ways that the bridge touches down on this whole part of the city, it is really starting to act as a destination for community, as much as, again, a pathway between communities. This is a place that now has become almost one of our only versions of a public piazza. There are events, celebrations, where we get to see each other. And I think that's important in a city like Los Angeles, because LA is a city of, in many ways, these parallel experiences. We're all in the car together. We're all heading in the same direction, but you don't want to look next to you because you see somebody and it freaks you out. Or, we go to the movie theater and you're all sitting there together. You're all watching something in front of you, but you generally don't interact. And in fact, that's becoming more and more uncomfortable. Or we're at the beach, kind of the quintessential Los Angeles landscape, but we all sit there and look at the water, and we don't actually look at the people on the blanket next to us. This is one of the few places where people turn and see each other passing by, walking on the sidewalk with their family at night, being a part of a festival, and seeing someone who they might not have seen before. I think, for me, when you mentioned middle space, I think maybe this is a little bit of that version. It's not home, it's not your private space, it's not a completely public space, it's a place that you can access and maybe be more connected to a broader community that you normally don't get to see.
Can I ask you, when you design something like this, is it like, do you work it out with the city that this is its purpose, or is it like The Brutalist? It's like, I'm secretly trying to create this kind of space, but I'm just going to tell them I'm building a bridge.
I could sometimes fantasize that we could keep these things secret.
Yeah.
But I think the only way you get to do a project like this is if your intentions are really upfront and completely clear and very honest. And maybe people don't understand exactly the implications or exactly the form of what it is that you're trying to make. But I think it's important to say this is what we're trying to do. When we started this project, we were meeting with the different communities. We met in Boyle Heights. And the first public meeting we had, I could tell there was intense skepticism. We were showing all of the drawings. They were very accurate renderings, but they were suspicious. And I don't blame them because they had been sold renderings many times before. The way that we created a different conversation is we made a model that was 75 feet long. We had to have the public school auditorium or gymnasium to show it. And it was at such a big scale that you couldn't hide anything. And it totally changed the conversation. So I think even in the way that you have the conversation leading up to what it is that you're doing, that's a part of really starting this public-private conversation dialectic.
So this is a very concrete example of what this panel is trying to illustrate. I want to talk about them like in a broader social policy and then internal. So you wrote that book. Since you wrote that book, I mean, one who is not you might say things have gotten worse, but have you seen examples of ways in which people have broken through this or sort of accessed this different space, or experiments that people have done? Like, what have you seen to try and address this kind of divide between your personal, what planet was it? That was the
Saturn.
Saturn, yes,
Yeah.
the Saturn problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm very interested in this, and I'm very interested in physical form. I do want to just sort of put out there the sort of notion that we've been talking about new urbanism now for decades, the sort of idea that we can change the physical landscape of America so that people aren't in single-family homes, that they're forced more closely together. and that, I lived in a classic new urbanist cut-up brownstone in DC for a long time and walked the dog on the same 4 blocks. And I mean, I have a very unfriendly face. I own that about myself.
Oh, no, you don't.
And I wear weird socks. But like, I sometimes didn't even know the people who in my building. Like we would pass, like it was 8 units in the building, and we'd pass each other on the stairs and not say hello. And I certainly didn't know people in the neighborhood. So like there is some element to me that I think that this is internal to ourselves, sort of a desire, a worry about what the experience would be of talking to somebody that we don't know, or sort of a fear of discovering that they are a January 6er, or whatnot. And so that there's a limit to how much we can manipulate this through physical space. I think that there is an interesting a festival like this, or that there are efforts now to have Jeffersonian dinners where you bring people together and have a moderated conversation that forces people to have interact in ways in their own neighborhood beyond talk about the weather or the terrible traffic at Main and Harlem or whatever it is. And so I do think that there are things that we can do, but it fundamentally comes down to a desire in ourselves.
Oh, that's so American. It's always up to us.
Yes,
it's
certainly.
ourselves.
I mean, when my grandfather left in the morning to go to work, he knew that he was not going to see my grandmother for the rest of the day. And like, my grandfather was a piece of work, so my grandmother may have liked that.
See you later.
Yeah. But like, I'm in touch with my wife all day, and I'm in touch with my kids, and like, we are very connected that way. And that time crowds out the space that you might have for the sorts of interactions that it looks like people are having there on the bridge. And so I do think fundamentally there is a sort of there's an id that we all need to access, that we want to have the uncomfortable conversation with someone we don't understand, don't really experience, have common experience with, that there is some sort of emotional barrier, and that needs to be bridged even beyond the physical space.
Well, I can talk about how I did that, but I'm only the moderator on this panel. So Virginia, help us out. Like, how do we access that? Because it feels difficult. So maybe just guide us a little bit through, because when you were talking, I mean, I think the thing that I felt overwhelmed by was the sense that the reason we need this is because there's so much noise, like everywhere, all the time.
Right.
And so there's just something like it's just a kind of tired, like we're seeking alone time because we fundamentally need it, not because we're assholes or addicted to video games or whatever. It's just there's so much input all of the time.
Right.
And we're just like one human being trying to live through the day. So,
yeah,
so
exactly.
we need it. So what feels healthy to you in terms of what he's talking about? Like finding reserves so that you can reach out to people who live on Saturn and also take care of yourself.
Right. Great question. So there's a couple things here. So on the one hand, we are social creatures, as we all know, but we need this balance between time in social relationships and time with ourselves. But what I found is that for each person, that balance is different. And so it's important to know yourself. So for some people, they can handle all of this very extroverted, busy, noisy, very productive. They thrive on it. I mean, we probably all know somebody like that. And so they might just need like little sips of solitude. 5 minutes, they're good, right?
Yeah.
Other people, they're taking in all of this input, and it is overstimulating, and it's too much. And so their balance is they need to go away and shut that door and not be in an open concept house and have some private space and, rejuvenate and recover. And so in my interviews with people, this is probably the number one reason they tell me when I say, what do you get out of it? Why do you like being alone? They say, I just need to recharge, right? They need to get back up to baseline. And what's interesting is they can't access, I would say we generally can't access all these great benefits of solitude, like creativity and self-insight, if we're totally depleted and exhausted. So sometimes positive solitude looks like vegging out for a while, just to like recover your energy. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not bad solitude, right? Sometimes people feel guilty, like I'm just chilling, I'm looking at Netflix. It's okay to do that for a while, but once we're back up to baseline and solitude has served that purpose of energy restoration, then we can start to think clearly and process those emotions and get back to our authentic self, or even just do the thing we love that we just want to do by ourselves. And that's very nourishing. And then we can go back out into the world a better person, a whole person.
One last thing before we open it up for questions. One part of your research I found really interesting was about gender differences.
Right.
Because I mean, one of the issues with solitude is that people lose track of their loneliness signal. They can't find when they are over solitude, but that tends more to be men.
Right.
Right? And
Yes.
I had never heard that before, that the growing trends in solitude actually are good for women
Yes.
and worse for men.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. So women are socialized in most societies, certainly also in America, to be the emotional caretakers, to be emotionally available. Even if you're not actually a mother or not a wife, you still, if you're presenting as a woman, you carry that kind of expectation. And so the idea of a woman saying, no thanks, I'm not going to spend time with you, or go to the family event, or I'm going to take some time for me. There's a lot of internalized guilt about that, because it means you're not living up to the expectation that you're available. But women need to also be available to themselves. And so the women I have interviewed, they say that's really helpful, solitude, hearing their own voice again, right? Not being plugged into everybody else.
And that becoming more socially acceptable. Like if more people are spending time alone, you're spending time alone, it's less conspicuous.
Yes, and it normalizes it. It validates it, says,
Yeah.
okay, this is a normal thing to want and need.
Whereas for men, it seems like there's a little bit of the opposite
That's right.
happening. Can you just say what that is?
Yeah, well, I think men, for many decades, it's been normalized that they'll step away from the table, go to their
Bengals game.
den or whatever, Bengals game, yes.
Watch them lose.
And just it's okay, and all the women stay in the public realm. But
Low blow.
right.
Well, I was just at a Pirates game, so yeah, keep going, yeah.
Yeah, so we know that men need to, that they lack the number of close friendships. Women report saying, I have X number of people to go to if I have a problem, and they're different people, family members, close friends, spouse. But men seem to have fewer of those, and so it does seem like they need to get into more close connections interpersonally with people, and spend less of that time alone.
So the trends in solitude are kind of normalizing a not healthy behavior for them. Yeah,
Right.
it's I'd never heard that before. Okay, friends, does anyone? Yes, you. I saw you first.
I'm Judy Sparks, and I'm the director of Allstate. And I was just reflecting, listening to the talk about the impacts of architecture. When I first joined the Allstate board 20 years ago, there are offices where you'd go inside and you go down these long, thick carpeted hallways of closed doors. And what Tom Wilson did when he came in was he blew out all the walls and made it completely open space. And it just, it changed the culture of the organization immensely. So
It changed it in a positive direction?
much more positive. People were collaborating more. I mean, and it was getting harder and harder to find the right answers. And that space helped a lot.
Yeah.
Can I touch on that for a second? Just quickly, I think that's true, and there was absolutely a real trend to open up those offices to not only be able to create those connections, but to flatten a bit, at least the perceptions of hierarchies, which had also systematically separated and pulled people apart. One of the challenges now has been that the pandemic turned all of that on its head as people left the offices, left office culture, and worked from home. And it's been a very unclear and uneven re-entry into office culture. We're seeing that in a number of our projects where there is a kind of generational difference between who wants to come back to the office for those benefits, those kind of social and interactive benefits, and who would rather not for any number of other reasons, ranging from home responsibilities that working from home make easier, or maybe that it's a bit easier to not have to interact on a daily basis. But it is really changing the dynamic again, and I think it's unclear for anybody either working in office space development or people managing that kind of space, where that trend is really going to continue to go.
Yes, and the glasses, hi.
Hi, my name's Rebecca. I'm Canadian, and there's only some moments in this festival where I felt very Canadian, and right this minute is one of them. And part of it is because I want to talk about individualism in this, because it strikes me when I think about some of the broader institutional and societal forces, like institutions like the church or various kinds of churches breaking down, or technology putting us with a robot in our pocket, and the kinds of things that really bring us to a more individualized way of living. It means that we're, like, when you're talking about the Jeffersonian dinners and stuff, I feel like we're now having to recreate that middle layer by ourselves, weirdly. Like, there's like, oh, I have to figure out how to make that middle layer richer in my own life, where before, maybe I'm being weirdly nostalgic, but I feel like more of us had, I don't know, clubs we belong to, faith communities, ethnic communities, all kinds of different sort of middle layer things. And what we're learning in social health research is that we need all of it. Like, we need diverse people, but we also need diverse, like, levels of depth, right? You need people you talk to and you know their name and you wave on the street, and you need people that you bare your soul to. And I'm struck by the kind of, are we moving to a really individualized way of having to build community? And that seems really odd to me.
That's interesting, yeah. That seems counterintuitive. I just got back from Greece myself, and I have never felt more American, because I was like, oh, they have Saturn everywhere. Everybody's hanging out all day long. Every neighborhood has its square. Nobody's on their cell phones. Like this is like a me problem. This isn't necessarily a universal problem. You had a question? Yes, Dahlia's friend. I only know Dahlia, but I don't know your name. But yeah, yeah, good.
And you are also the best, by the way, as a moderator.
Thank you.
Oh, yep, here we go. So Virginia, I wanted to circle back to something that you said in the very beginning of the conversation when you're talking about the importance of solitude, not isolation. And when you're in that solitude space, the tools to reconnect with yourself. And especially I liked what you said at the end about, as women, like refinding, elevating, amplifying your voice. So I was wondering if you could talk on what those tools were that you referred to.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So the skills that we need for solitude, and I use the word skills very intentionally because I think we've all heard of social skills, right? And that shows the cultural preference for being social. But these solitude skills, the internal ones are all about self-connection. So what I have found is that people who can benefit from solitude, they know how to regulate their emotions, and they know how to sit with emotions even when they're uncomfortable. Because I think lots of people, even if they want to be alone, they're alone, and then all these thoughts come flooding up, all these anxieties, all of these fears or sadness, and that feels very uncomfortable and distressing. And so some people pop right back out and say, this doesn't feel good, I'm going to go find somebody. But the people who are really skillful about solitude know that those emotions, that's information, it's messengers. And so they sit with those emotions until they can get to some kind of insight. And so those abilities of emotion regulation and introspection, these are things we all can learn, and that children can learn as well. And those go a long way toward helping solitude not be boring, not be a lonely place, not be scary. But the other set of skills that I've discovered are much more practical. It's about, first, validate that alone time is necessary and normal. I need this. And then carve out time and stay committed to it, right? Put it on your calendar, carve out the time, but negotiate with the people in your life. Like, I have 2 kids and a spouse who loves to hang out with me. So I have to plan it, and I have to put it on the calendar, get the agreement, make a trade, right, so that I can have that alone time. And then when I finally get to my solitude date, the other skill is don't waste it. Be mindful. Don't get lost on your phone or suddenly, oh, the to-do list, I have 3 hours, I can get this done. No, you've wasted it. Be really intentional about that time so that you can use it for what's really nourishing.
You know, it's always been a mystery to me. It's like, Why is there sex education in schools? You can find out anything you want to know about sex in so many places, but not emotional education.
Right.
Like, why isn't that
Yes.
a required class? Like, somehow we have to remake it every generation. Everybody has to figure it out for like
Right.
years and years, and then when they're like 65, they finally get it. Like, just teach it, for
Yes.
God's sake. Yes.
And your conversation about private and public spaces reminded me a lot of another Virginia Woolf, who wrote a lot about the tension between the private and the public self. And she has this famous essay, A Room of One's Own, where she talks about the power of just a physical space, a private space for women especially, to retreat into your own world and to like cultivate that interiority and that rich inner life that I think are markers of a really healthy solitude. Mm-hmm. But I also think the same technologies that have isolated us from that middle ring, from the people that we don't choose, our neighbors, our village, are also the technologies that have made it in almost an unparalleled way easy to run from ourselves. Like young people are spending a third of their years on screens now. Like if you track pickups of Instagram or your phone, it's like hundreds of times per day. And so in an environment where it's so easy to run from yourself, where there are notifications, doom scrolling, where that stuff is very real, I'm wondering, how does that dynamic show up in your research about the power of solitude, especially for this generation?
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up, because we do have research showing that social media is a great interrupter of solitude, of all that positive solitude. Because yes, technically you're physically alone, but if you are on your phone, in particular on social media, you are now outward facing. You are not inward facing. And so some of the research I've done shows that being, especially young people, so people in their 20s specifically, being on social media actually helps them feel less lonely and less bored temporarily, but it comes at the cost of they end up having lower levels of things like identity development, knowing who they are, psychological well-being, finding meaning and purpose. So I think it's like this kind of tempting thing that like, oh, it's going to make me feel better. Like I'll get this hit of feeling kind of connected, but at the cost of what I could really have used with that room of my own, to quote Virginia Woolf, and have that self-connection that's so important.
Yes, sir, in the back. You, yes.
Hi, Jason Darkworth from Philadelphia. Have any of the panelists personally experienced the loss of the middle rings in their own life and then taken action to rebuild those middle rings?
Sir.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Washington in a new urbanist community called DuPont Circle, where I was unfriendly to everyone and then didn't understand why they didn't want to talk to me. And so we moved to Providence, explicitly to a neighborhood, a street that our real estate agent told us where they had been doing an annual potluck for 50 years.
Wow.
And that was I mean, it was a good. It was a good price too. But the street was a big draw, and it was remarkable the degree to which knowing our neighbors. We had a tragedy on the street when a young father died. We had an interesting interaction where everyone presumed that we were all Clinton voters, and then discovered the day of the election that someone put out a Trump sign. Like a whole series of interactions that really did open my eyes and make me feel more connected to Providence than I had to my neighborhood in Washington.
I will say I did a whole project for The Atlantic. It's called We Live Here Now. I live in a neighborhood which is very neighborhoody for some reason. It's Eckington. It's in Northeast DC. And we discovered that somebody who'd moved into an empty house, they were not just January 6ers, they were like the leaders of the January 6th movement. It was the mother of the one woman who died on January 6th. And they had every January 6er sort of running through that house and everybody in the prison. And so we followed Simone Weil's quote that like stuck in my head. It's like being a neighbor only requires you to look to your neighbor and ask the question, what are you going through? And believe me, it was difficult. Like they were at the, and it became even more difficult when Trump let out all the January 6ers who then came to stay in that house down the block from me. So, and including Stewart Road and sort of all the famous ones. But it required a commitment to that principle, the kind of like, what are you going through? What are you going through? I'm going to just set aside, like, I'm going to change my mind, or I'm going to change her mind, she's going to change mine, and we just like stuck to it for a year, and it was an experiment in what happened. So I can't say it's successful. It's not necessarily potluck, but it was an experiment. It really did teach me a lot. Okay, maybe just one more question from this side. You, Alvin. You're just close enough I can read your tag, so yeah, but this is it.
Hi, my name's Alvin. I'm from Boston. I have a question for you, Mark. This may be related to research. Like the stat that was mentioned at first, over the past 2 or 3 decades, that middle circle has been kind of deteriorating. So that means there's a generation, myself included, that is just the normal. We have no prior knowledge of how things were before. So given this reality, is it realistic to expect that we can go back? And if so, what are going to be like some key factors and challenges?
Brother, I thought that Tim Scott was going to win the Republican nomination, so asking me to predict what's going to happen is like I don't have a good sense. I think that there is a deep, innate human desire to understand other parts of the world. Like on the bus here to Aspen, I was talking to a guy who's an insect specialist and has just come from the burning river in the Amazon and is trying to learn about different cultures. I think that absent these middle ring relationships, we are fundamentally isolated in bubbles of our own, and that your generation and my generation and younger generations are going to want to discover what's out there in the same way that previous generations want to discover more of what's in the world.
I'm going to say I love that question. I'm just going to say 2 quick things. One thing is for everyone to retire the term bowling alone. I know it's a good book. I know it was incredibly influential, but when you say that to a young person, they're like, bowling? Like, what are you talking about? Like, it feels like something from 1,000,000 trillion years ago. The other thing is I think for people to respect how communities form online. I know this from my kids. They form a lot of communities online. They meet up, they don't meet up, but for us to start thinking of that as community, like not as the opposite of community or as wasting your time or as being in your room by yourself or whatever. There are tons of things that my middle child on Discord has created in the world that started in Discord, and that's cool, great, like music communities, all sorts of things. So I think that's one of you can start writing about that and become an academic, somebody who's done that and has experience with it, but I think that is missing in this conversation sometimes. Thank you guys, you were amazing. Thank you so much.